Chapter 36. Grouping for a Final Assault. Makkah's fall to the Muslims was a great blow for all the unbelievers in Arabia. None of them could have imagined that the structure of disbelief had so rotted away from inside that it could no longer withstand a determined attack. In such a prolonged confrontation as took place in Arabia at that time, it was not to be imagined that once Makkah had fallen to the Muslims, all the unbelievers would lay down their arms. There were still major tribes in Arabia which maintained their stand in opposition to Islam. To them, the situation was not over yet, despite the fall of Makkah. They felt that they could muster a force large enough to defeat the Muslims. One such major tribe was the Hawazin, who lived in a mountainous area close to Taif. Taif itself was the most fertile area in Arabia and was where the idol called Allat, the second largest idol of the Arabs after Hubal, was worshipped. Taif was also the hometown of another major tribe called the Thaqif. Notables of the two tribes met for consultations. Their main worry was that Muhammad, peace be upon him, would inevitably turn against them now that he had overcome the Quraysh. They felt that their very identity was threatened. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was sure to change their religion, destroy their idols, and impose his authority on them. None of this was a welcome prospect as far as they were concerned. Hence, they decided to take the initiative against the Muslims before the latter had time to march towards them. Hawazin was the most active partner in this unholy alliance. Its leader, Malik ibn Auf, was a young man of immense courage. He tried hard to gather all the clans for this final assault. Several tribes joined in: the Nasr, Jusham, Sa'd ibn Bakr, and groups of Hilal. The notable absentees were the tribes of the Ka'b and the Kilab. The allied forces of those tribes agreed to give the overall command to Malik as they admired his enthusiasm. But Malik's enthusiasm was not coupled with any practical wisdom. This is evident from the following conversation between Malik and an old man from Jusham called Duraid ibn al-Summa, who was the sage of his tribe. Had Duraid been 20 years younger, he would in all probability have been the commander. Now that he was very old, his contribution was merely to give advice. When the forces of Hawazin and their allies encamped at a valley called Autas, Duraid said to Malik, "You have now assumed the leadership of your people. This is a day which will have a bearing on the future. I hear noises of domestic animals, such as sheep and donkeys, and I hear young children crying. Can you tell me why that is?" Malik replied, "I have asked the people to bring their property and their families with them. I want every soldier to know that his family and his wealth is right behind him so that he fights hard to protect them." Duraid said disapprovingly, "You are no more than a shepherd. What would stop a fighter fleeing from the battle? If you are winning, no one will be of use to you except a man who can carry a sword or a spear. If you are losing, you will bring on your people the greatest scandal of all, and they will lose all their property." Duraid then asked about the Ka'b and the Kilab, and when he was told that they were not joining in, he said, "Courage and determination are absent. They would not have been absent if the score was one of glory. I would have preferred you to follow their example." He then asked about the Hawazin dignitaries who were taking part, and when the name of the two brothers, Amr and Auf, were mentioned, he said, "They are of no great use and their absence would not have caused any great harm." He then addressed Malik with this sound advice: "Malik, you cannot achieve much by bringing the whole of the Hawazin to the battlefield. You would be better advised to put them in their well-protected areas before meeting the Muslims on your horses. If you win, your people will join you. If you lose, you will have saved your families and your property." Malik, however, was driven by his enthusiasm, and he did not want Duraid to win any praise for his opinion. He said to him, "By God, I would not do that. You have aged, and so has your reason." He then addressed his people, "People of Hawazin, you will either follow my orders, or I shall fall on this sword of mine until it pierces right through me." They pledged that they would obey him, and Duraid said, "This is a battle which I have neither witnessed nor missed." Thus, the Hawazin marched with their women and children and all their wealth for the decisive meeting with the Muslims. Preparing to meet the enemy. Back in Makkah, the Prophet heard that the Hawazin were preparing to fight the Muslims. He therefore sent Abdullah ibn Abi Hadrad from the tribe of the Aslam to gather information. He instructed him to go right into their camp and pretend to be one of them until he had gathered detailed information about them. The man went and did as the Prophet said. He even spoke to Malik and made sure of the plans of the Hawazin. He went back to report to the Prophet what he had learned. He told him the Hawazin were planning to march to a valley called Hunan. When the Prophet heard all this, he smiled and said, "This will be a prize for the Muslims, God willing." The Prophet started his preparations to meet the Hawazin in battle. He asked the people of Makkah, including those who had not become Muslims, to help him with his preparations. He specifically asked Safwan ibn Umayyah to lend him some arms which he heard that Safwan had. Safwan asked, "Do you want to take those arms by force, Muhammad?" Peace be upon him. The Prophet answered, "No, we want to borrow them, and we guarantee to return them to you." Safwan then agreed and gave him 100 shields with their accompanying arms. This is yet another instance of cooperation with unbelievers for a definite purpose. When the Muslims had completed their preparations, the Prophet left Makkah at the head of his army on Saturday, the 6th of Shawwal, 28th January, AD 630. His army now numbered 12,000. There were 10,000 with him when he left Medina, marching towards Makkah. Now, the Muslim army was swelled by 2,000 from among the people of Makkah, some of them still non-Muslims. It was a large army by Muslim standards. One must remember that 2 years earlier, when the Prophet came to Makkah for his Umrah, only 1,400 people were with him. That was the time when he concluded his peace agreement with the Quraysh at Al-Hudaybiyah. The same number had fought with him the major battle of Khaybar against the Jews a few months later. It was not surprising that many people would have looked at that large Muslim army and thought that nothing would stand up to it. That was indeed a natural feeling after the ease with which Makkah had fallen to the Muslims. The majority of the believers in Islam felt that idolatry was in its last throes, could not put up any resistance worth mentioning. The newcomers to Islam were full of euphoria as they saw the Muslim army moving to meet the unbelievers. For once, it seemed the Muslims were a little too relaxed before an enormous task, but why should they not be? They used to be very few in number, yet were able to win major battles. Now they looked at their size and felt that numerical strength was no longer lacking. In previous conflicts, the smaller forces had been those of the Muslims. This time, however, they felt that the size of the enemy army was irrelevant. Theirs was a large army, and they would not be overrun on account of their inferior numbers. The Prophet and the Muslim army reached the valley of Hunan on Tuesday evening, 10th of Shawwal. Reports suggest that it was the Prophet's plan to take his enemy by surprise before the light of day, when they would still be asleep. He therefore mobilized his forces in ranks, assigned flags and banners, appointed commanders mostly from among the Muhajirin and the Ansar, and gave the command of his horsemen to Khalid ibn al-Walid. Having done that, he ordered his army to move. A plan to defeat the Muslims. Malik ibn Auf, the commander of the enemy forces, had already encamped in the valley of Hunan, a sloping valley whose very steep hilly entrance had several narrow points. It opened up further on. Malik wanted to utilize the strategic advantage afforded by that entrance. He therefore placed some detachments of his forces at the top of each narrow point and mobilized large numbers of his forces on the sides, keeping some of them absolutely unobserved. The Hawazin were renowned for their marksmanship with arrows. Malik also wanted to make use of that skill to score a clear advantage. He placed some of his best marksmen at high points close to those straight and narrow areas. He ordered them to pour their arrows over the Muslims once they saw them there. He hoped that that would cause chaos among the Muslim army, and then the rest of his forces would launch a full-scale attack against them. This seemed to be Malik's plan. It seems also that he was well aware of the moves of the Muslims. Without such intelligence, it would have been difficult for him to make such an effective plan. He must have sent spies to gather intelligence of the Prophet's moves. On the other hand, there might have been some people from Makkah who still harbored grudges against Islam and wanted the Hawazin to triumph. As the Muslim army moved with the first rays of light, hardly able to see its way, they were unaware that their enemies had taken their positions and were ready to meet them as they approached. The horsemen, under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid, marched at the front, followed by the infantry battalions, and at the end marched the Prophet on his white mule, wearing his body armor, which consisted of 2 shields. With him were some of the leading figures of his companions, his uncle, Al-Abbas, and quite a few of his relatives. As soon as the front forces reached the entrance to the valley, they were surprised by a heavy shower of arrows aimed at them from all angles. They could hardly tell where the arrows came from. They suddenly found themselves in a very difficult situation which necessitated retreat. Their retreat, however, was disorderly. The unbelievers did not waste time. They attacked the Muslims as they retreated, bringing in large forces with mounted and infantry units. The Muslim army was soon in absolute chaos, with soldiers moving everywhere, most of them trying to flee. There was a terrible scramble, and the Muslim soldiers were soon overwhelmed. Malik ibn Auf had ordered his soldiers to concentrate their efforts and to launch their attack as if they were one man. He also told them to break the sheaths of their swords, a gesture signaling determination to fight to the end, and to have their cattle and women behind them. At that point in the battle, the Hawazin and the Thaqif forces were following Malik's orders to the letter. Many people from Makkah, some of them still unbelievers, went with the Muslim army. Among them was Safwan ibn Umayyah, whom the Prophet had allowed a period of 4 months to think about Islam and define his position towards it. When the Muslim army was in this state of chaos, a man from the Quraysh said to Safwan, "I am bringing you the happy news of the defeat of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. By God, they will never be able to make amends for this defeat." Safwan answered angrily, "You describe the victory of the Bedouin Arabs as happy news? I would much sooner be under the leadership of a man from the Quraysh than under the leadership of a Bedouin." Rallying the troops. When the Prophet saw his soldiers in such disorder, he shouted to them, "Where are you going, people? Come back to me. I am God's messenger. I am Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace be upon him." Few people took heed. Perhaps they did not hear the Prophet shouting. They cared for nothing around them. Soon, the Prophet was in a vulnerable position. Only a small group of the Muhajirin and the Ansar and a few individuals of his own household remained steadfast with him. Among these was Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was known for his loud voice. The Prophet instructed him to shout to the Ansar and the Muhajirin to come back. Al-Abbas then started to shout, "You Ansar, who had welcomed your Prophet and supported him, you Muhajirin, who pledged to sacrifice your lives, come back to God's messenger." As soon as any one of the Muhajirin or the Ansar heard this shouting, he turned back and walked towards the voice of Al-Abbas, saying, "Here I come, here I come." If any one of them was impeded in his move towards the Prophet, he would dismount in order to move quickly to join the Prophet. In the meantime, the Prophet continued to move towards the enemy with those surrounding him. Indeed, he moved dangerously close to them. He was completely exposed to their swords and spears. It may seem strange that the commander of the army should so expose himself. The attitude of the Prophet, however, revealed the strength of his faith. There was absolutely no trace whatsoever of panic on his part. His conviction in the truth of his message and the nature of his role was never shaken. This is absolutely clear in his shouting to his people, "I am God's messenger." Moreover, the Prophet had been told by God in the Quran that God was responsible for his security. His drawing close to the enemy must be viewed in that light. He was absolutely confident that God's promise would come true, hence he must not fear for his life. The Prophet took some dust in his hand and threw it at the enemy army, saying, "Your faces are blackened," as a small group of the Muhajirin and the Ansar gathered around the Prophet. Events started to turn. That group was able to withstand the pressure of the enemy attack. As it grew larger, with more people coming back, it was able first to hold the enemy and then to turn the pressure against it. By that time, it was broad daylight and they were able to see the position of their enemy. They launched a determined counterattack, and soon chaos overtook the enemy forces. The Muslims chased them everywhere, killing some and capturing others. A large number fled. Among those who fled was Malik ibn Auf, who managed to get to Taif, where he was admitted into its fortress. He left behind all the cattle and the property which he had ordered his tribesmen to bring to the battlefield. All that became the property of the Muslims. It was by far the greatest loot the Muslims had ever laid their hands on. Moreover, they captured all the women and children the Hawazin soldiers had brought with them. It is said that when the Prophet threw the dust on the army of the Hawazin and the Thaqif, every enemy soldier felt dust in his eyes. That was the turning point for them, when they started to be confused and disorderly. An appropriate look at events. The events of this encounter are mentioned briefly in the Quran. On the day of Hunain, when you were pleased at your numerical power, you found out that it was of no avail to you. The vast expanse of the earth seemed to you very narrow, and you began to flee. Then God sent down His reassurance and tranquility on His messenger and on the believers, and He dispatched soldiers whom you did not see and inflicted suffering on the unbelievers. That is the rightful reward for those who reject the faith. 9:25-26. These two verses give an important message. Numerical strength is of little importance if the other elements necessary for victory are overlooked or neglected. It is important for Muslims to be on their guard against any complacency in their attitude. The Prophet was eager that the Muslims would always observe their moral code in war. He is reported to have passed a woman from the enemy killed by the forces under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid. He immediately dispatched a message to Khalid ordering him not to kill any child, woman, or elderly man. It was not for the Muslims to kill women. When the battle was over, the Prophet ordered all the cattle, property, and prisoners taken by the Muslims to be gathered together and dispatched to a valley called Al-Jirana, a short distance from Mecca. He appointed Masud ibn Amr al-Ghifari to be in charge of the spoils of war. He intended to distribute them later. Meanwhile, the Muslim army still had an important task to finish. For the first time in several years, the Muslims stood at the brink of defeat in Hunain. This followed immediately after their conquest of Mecca. For any army to suffer a defeat after its greatest victory can only be described as a setback of mammoth proportions. That initial defeat, however, provides an important lesson for Muslims everywhere and in every age. Every Muslim should realize that victory comes from God, not from numerical strength or force of arms. God states in the Quran on two different occasions that victory is granted only by God. 3:126 and 8:10. Muslims then must heed this and work for victory on the basis of that understanding. They do not claim that victory can be achieved only by believing in God and the message of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Victory is a prize to be sought by hard work. But unless that hard work is coupled with faith, God leaves the combatants to their own devices. When Muslims fight unbelievers, the Muslims must rely on their faith as much as they rely on their arms, if not more. They must be aware that they fight for God's cause, and such they should sacrifice for it everything they are called upon to sacrifice. At no time does a Muslim go to war thinking that he is going to achieve an easy victory. He is not after material gain. What he is after is to remove certain impedance from the path of the Islamic message. It is for God's cause that he fights, and his aim is to ensure that people are free to listen to God's call and to believe in it if they so desire. At Hunain, the Muslims lost sight momentarily of their true objective. They also lost sight of the real cause of their past victories. That cause was that they had the proper perspective on their own situation and realized that they were fighting the battle of Islam for the sake of Islam, ready to sacrifice for it whatever was necessary in order to achieve victory. When they lost sight of this, it was easy for their enemy to take them by surprise and cause chaos in their ranks. It was sufficient for the Hawazin to be able to force the Muslims to retreat a little and for that retreat to herald a major debacle, which most certainly would have been the result of the Battle of Hunain, had it not been for the Prophet's own determination and clear vision. Many historians put the blame for the initial setbacks suffered by the Muslims at Hunain on the new elements that swelled their ranks. Those were people from Mecca who had just embraced Islam. Indeed, some of them still had not. They say that those people joined the army hoping to share in the loot. But when the chaos overtook the Muslim army, it was not only they who fled. Reports suggest that at one time only 10 people remained with the Prophet. When Al-Abbas, his uncle, at the Prophet's instruction started to call the Muhajirin and the Ansar to come back, reports suggest that around 100 of them soon gathered around the Prophet. This means that he was for some time fighting with only about 100 soldiers. The bulk of the Muhajirin and the Ansar were overtaken by the chaos. It was necessary to remind them of their position before they rallied to the Prophet. Hence, the setback cannot be explained away by lack of courage on the part of the new soldiers. The Quranic admonition to the Muslims in its comment on the events of Hunain suggests that they all shared responsibility. One need not seek easy explanations in order to prevent the companions of the Prophet as free of all blame, or as having no share in the mistakes of that day. It does not help the cause of Islam in future generations to do so. The companions of the Prophet were the best Muslims. That is an absolute fact. They served the cause of Islam in such a way as to provide the best ideals for all Muslims in all generations to follow. But they must not be shown in such a light as to raise them above the level of human beings. If they are viewed as superhuman, they cease to be an example for future Muslim generations. If, on the other hand, one says that even the companions of the Prophet suffered when a feeling of complacency crept in, future generations will understand that they cannot afford to allow complacency to creep into them. Otherwise, they will suffer defeat after defeat. It is important for all Muslim generations to recognize that God will grant them victory if they themselves fulfill the requirements of victory. These include the pure motive of serving the cause of God, exerting their best efforts, coupled with a determination to make whatever sacrifice is necessary and to rely on God and trust in Him. A second battle. When the scales were turned against the Hawazin and victory was claimed totally by the Muslims, most of the Hawazin soldiers, including their commander, Malik ibn Auf, went to Taif, where they joined the Thaqif in their forts. A battalion went to the valley called Autas. The latter group represented the most immediate threat. It was necessary, therefore, to neutralize that threat. The Prophet sent a unit of his forces under the command of Ubayd Abu Amir al-Ash'ari. A battle erupted between the two sides, and it soon appeared that the battle would be resolved in the Muslims' favor. Some detailed reports of that battle exist, which suggest that Abu Amir himself fought 10 brothers of the enemy soldiers, one after the other. Every time one of them stood up to the Muslim commander, the latter called on him to accept Islam. When he did not respond, Abu Amir said, "My Lord, be witness to his rejection." Then Abu Amir killed him. He killed 9 of the 10 brothers in this way, calling on them one by one to accept Islam and praying God to be his witness when they did not respond. When he clashed with the 10th, again he called on him to accept Islam. The man did not respond. Then Abu Amir said, "My Lord, be witness to his rejection." The man said, "My Lord, do not be witness." Abu Amir let him go. It was not long after this battle that the man accepted Islam and became a good Muslim. When the Prophet saw him, he said, "This man is the one left by Abu Amir." Abu Amir himself was killed in this battle. 2 enemy soldiers attacked him together. One of them hit him in the chest and the other hit him in the knees. A cousin of his, Abdullah ibn Qas, who is better known in history books as Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, took command of the Muslim battalion. Apparently, the first hit suffered by Abu Amir was not fatal. Abu Musa reports that he went to his cousin when he was hit and asked him who had hit him. Abu Amir pointed the man out and Abu Musa chased him. He tried to chase him, but Abu Musa said to him tauntingly, "Are you not ashamed of yourself fleeing away? Why don't you show your courage and stand up to me?" The man turned back and Abu Musa was able to kill him. He went back to Abu Amir and said to him, "God has killed the man who hit you." Abu Amir asked him to pull the spear out of his knee. When he did so, blood gushed forth. Abu Amir realized that this wound was fatal. He therefore asked Abu Musa to convey his greetings to the Prophet and ask him to pray for his soul. He appointed him commander. Abu Musa and his soldiers fought the unbelievers until they inflicted a heavy defeat on them. Soon afterwards, Abu Amir died and the Muslim battalion went back to the Prophet. Abu Musa found the Prophet sitting on a bed of sand which had left its mark on his back and sides. Abu Musa gave him a report on the battle and conveyed to him the message of Abu Amir and his request to the Prophet to pray for him. The Prophet asked for water to be brought in and had ordinary ablutions. He lifted his arms and prayed to God, "My Lord, forgive Ubayd Abu Amir. My Lord, place him on the day of judgment ahead of many of your creation." Abu Musa said to the Prophet, "And pray to God to forgive me as well, please." The Prophet said, My Lord, forgive Abdullah ibn Qais his sins and assign to him an honorable entrance to heaven on the Day of Judgment. The Battle of Autas was a follow-up to the Battle of Hunain. It was necessary because if the Prophet had left that force of unbelievers intact in the place where they encamped, it would have represented a serious threat to Islam. The Prophet realized that it was important for him to break all resistance put up by the unbelievers. Hence, he did not hesitate to meet them on the battleground they had chosen. After the Prophet and the Muslims achieved victory over the Hawazin at the Battle of Hunain, and after the follow-up engagement at Autas, which ended in yet another defeat for the unbelievers, the main concentration of forces hostile to Islam, which represented a threat to the Muslims, was at Taif, where the tribe of Thaqif had their fortified dwellings. The Prophet's approach was always a very serious one. He would not leave the Thaqif to continue their hostility to Islam without trying to subdue them. He therefore ordered his army to march towards Taif. The Siege of Taif. Taif was a fortified city whose inhabitants were well trained to withstand any siege. The Thaqif had prepared themselves for a long siege and took into their forts enough provisions to last them a long time. They had made up their minds not to succumb to the forces of Islam as long as they could put up any effective resistance. The Muslim army arrived at Taif to find its people well protected in their forts. It was the Prophet's plan not to rush his army into battle in the hope that the Thaqif would reconsider their position and decide to give up. As soon as the Muslim army drew near to the forts, a shower of arrows poured over them. A few soldiers were killed and a number of others were injured. The Muslim army was then forced to draw back a little so that it could not be hit. The army took its positions and a siege was imposed on Taif. It continued for over 20 days. During this period, the Muslims tried hard to draw the unbelievers out of their fortifications. Their attempts were unsuccessful. The Muslims first asked the Thaqif to send down some of its best soldiers for individual duels, but the Thaqif declined. The Muslims taunted them and accused them of cowardice, but that did not influence the Thaqif's position. The Muslims then tried to hit them with stones, but all that was to little effect. A number of Muslims utilized a primitive form of tank made of wood in order to reach the wall of Taif's fort, hoping to make a hole in it. But the Thaqif replied by throwing over them pieces of red-hot iron, and this forced the Muslim soldiers to come out of their tank. As they did so, the Thaqif shot their arrows and killed a number of Muslims. The Muslims then tried to cut the Thaqif's vines. This worried the Thaqif, and they appealed to the Prophet not to do so for the sake of God and kinship. He responded by ordering his soldiers to stop cutting any vine. All the Muslims' attempts could not make any headway. The unbelievers of the Thaqif were still in their forts, which remained immune to any attack. The Prophet then caused it to be proclaimed that if any slave who belonged to the Thaqif deserted and joined the Muslims, he was to be set free immediately. Some 20 slaves managed to come out, and the Prophet granted them their freedom. From those slaves, the Prophet learned that the Thaqif had enough provisions to last them for a year. They were able to withstand the Muslim siege for that length of time. They remained resolved to continue their defiance as long as their provisions were sufficient to meet their needs. They would then fight to the last man. The Prophet then realized that it was time to reconsider his position. It seemed that prolonging the siege would be of little use. He consulted some of his companions about the situation. Nawfal ibn Muawiyah al-Dili said to him, "They are just like a fox in a hole. If you exhaust the fox's patience, you will get it out. If you leave it alone, it can cause you no harm." The Prophet realized that Nawfal's description was very accurate. Moreover, the consecrated months were about to begin. He was therefore more inclined to leave the Thaqif alone for the time being. He hoped that they would soon realize that Islam was the religion of truth and come to him voluntarily to declare their acceptance of Islam. He ordered his army to leave Taif and move back to Mecca. One must remember here an incident which took place some 11 years earlier. The Prophet had gone to Taif seeking support against the Quraysh. The attitude of the Thaqif was then very hostile. They ordered their children and slaves to abuse the Prophet. They hurled stones at him and chased him around until he had to seek shelter in an orchard which belonged to one of the leaders of Mecca, who himself was very hostile to him. At that point, the angel Gabriel came to him to say, "Muhammad, peace be upon him, your Lord has sent me to give you his greetings and to tell you that he heard what you sent to those people and their answers to you. I will close in these 2 mountains over them if you wish me to do so." The Prophet answered, "I would rather leave them a while in the hope that God will make their offspring people who worship him alone and do not ascribe divinity to anyone other than him." Now the Prophet still hoped that the Thaqif would come around. One of his companions suggested that he should pray to God to destroy them, but the Prophet prayed for them in these words, "My Lord, guide the Thaqif to the truth and relieve us of their burden." We will see later on that the Prophet's prayers were answered.